Okay, so firstly, I would really want to thank Professor Shantanu for this opportunity. I'm really happy to talk in front of you. And today I'll be discussing about the recent flash flood that happened on 7th of February and an avalanche that followed on 23rd of April in the upper Alaknanda catchment. But before I discuss these two events specifically, I would like to talk about the Hindu Kush Himalayan region in general and what are the terrain characteristics or the climate attributes which make the terrain vulnerable to these hazards and disasters. So as you can see, this is the Hindu Kush Himalayan region here, right from Afghanistan to Myanmar, also known as the third pole, right? And this red area here marks the upper Ganga catchment. This terrain, as you all know, is geologically very active, tectonically very active. There are regional thrusts here. There are several erosion agents like glaciers and rivers, a lot of mass movement activities also there. And perhaps this is one of the regions in the world which is most prone to disasters and hazards. There was a study which suggested that at least 76 reported disasters occur every year in this region. And if we classify these major hazards into broad categories, they would be hydrometeorological and geophysical hazards. Under hydrometeorological, we can have extreme precipitation events, glacial lake outburst floods or GLOFs, landslides or landslide lake outburst floods, shortly named as LLOFs. And recently, we are also seeing rise in rain over snow event, which further accelerate the melting of the glaciers and may help in generation of GLOFs. And of course, avalanches are there. Permafrost melting is also known to trigger large deep-seated landslides, although research is not much from the Hindu-Kush Himalayan region, except perhaps from the Tibetan Plateau. So we really need to understand firstly its distribution, where it is present and how it is influencing these hazards and disasters. So far, the geophysical hazards are concerned, we can broadly classify them into earthquakes and co-seismic landslides and the lofts. And needless to say, these all hazards, they are actually interrelated to each other. Often they are having cascading effects with one hazard or disaster leading to another disaster, right? So we can say that Hindu Kush Himalaya actually has a multi-hazard environment. Often the processes are complex. It's not a simple one-on-one relationship there. So to talk about the physical vulnerabilities, like in disaster terminology, when we talk about vulnerability, we are also taking into consideration the social aspect of it, which is very important in limiting the exposure and managing the disaster. But here I'll be only focusing on the physical attributes. So one of the dominant attribute that makes this region disaster prone are the steep slopes and the seismicity. So this study by Wadia et al. That published in 2019 characterized the entire area as per the average slope. So here you can see on the x-axis we have the percentage area, and on the y-axis we have the average slope, with about 50% of area having average slope greater than 20 degrees. And there's no one-on-one relationship between, of course, you can talk about that moderately steep slope, they are more prone to failure. But additionally, if they are weathered, how is the jointing pattern, if there's any overburden lying on that, they all affect how or when this the slopes would fail. And the second figure shows slice of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, where I've plotted the seismic activity from 1981 to 2018. And the pale yellow color that you're seeing is the Upper Ganga catchment. And I believe most of the seismic activity is concentrated along the NCT. And the GPS studies, they also indicate that the Garhwal Himalaya is showing high frequency of both moderate and high magnitude earthquakes. So that does make this terrain more vulnerable. The earthquake does two things. Of course, it does trigger co-seismic landslides, which can be interrelated to other disasters, but it also preconditions the ground, something known as ground cracking or fissure widening. It also does that, which can lead to multiple landslides or flash floods thereafter, even under the normal rainfall event in the following monsoon season. Now, there was an interesting study by Roback et al. In 2018, following the Gorkha earthquake of 2015, who tried to understand the distribution of landslide with the earthquake. And they found that there's not one-on-one relationship with the peak ground acceleration here. They found that large and moderate landslides, they coincide with the physiographic transition that lies between lesser and higher Himalaya, and they're characterized, in fact, by moderately steep but weathered slope. And also there is high mean annual precipitation. And this is what is shown in this first figure, where the gray line that you see here marks the density of the landslide per square kilometer. The black line here shows the percentage slopes over 40 degree. And the blue shading that I've done marks the average slope of 60 degree. Am I connected?
Yeah.
Okay.
You are.
So this blue stippling here marks the average slope of about 60 degree, and elevation, as you can see, is less than 2500 or so. So this is the zone where most of the activity was concentrated post the earthquake. Also, they found that besides some of the landslides which were concentrated near the epicenter of the earthquake, the density increased as the depth of the rupture increased towards the east. So you see the relationship between the spatial distribution and the earthquake is also complex, dictated by many factors. Further, the high Himalayan slopes, which are steep and did not see so many landslides, but these landslides perhaps ran out to a greater distance. They were coupled with the fluvial channels one-on-one, thereby enhancing the sediment supply immediately, aggrading the riverbed, and also they were capable of blocking the small tributary streams, thereby creating the lofts in the downstream areas. Therefore, these landslides, although they were less in number in higher Himalayan region, they were more disastrous from societal point of view. Okay, and if we look at the relationship of landslide frequency with an earthquake event, the recent study by Roser et al., again with respect to Gorkha earthquake, shows that the region-wise frequency of landslide, it goes on decreasing following an earthquake event, which is shown by this orange bar here. But it takes about 4 to 5 years for terrain to reach pre-earthquake landslide activity. And the blue parts here mark the triggering season, which is coupled with the monsoon precipitation here. Okay. The next characteristic which make the terrain physically vulnerable is perhaps the climate change. We all know globally we have been seeing an upward rising trend of the temperature, and that is also true for the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. If we talk about the mean annual precipitation, the last 60 years have shown a positive trend in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, and also the wet day anomaly, that is the percentage of days where the rainfall was greater than the average, is also steadily increasing, particularly after 2000, as you can see in this figure, right? So extreme precipitation, the days of extreme precipitation events are also increasing steadily in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. Of course, there is variation in here. The second figure here shows the temperature anomaly plotted both for India in orange and for Himalaya in the gray. Now, there has been increase in temperature for the entire Indian peninsula, but if we compare the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, the change or the rate of change has been higher for the Himalayan region. And also there's component of elevation dependent warming, where regions above 4,000 meters, they are experiencing more accelerated rate of warming. This, particularly the temperature rise, further makes the glaciers and the cryosphere also vulnerable to the rising temperatures. And that is also getting demonstrated in the shrinking glaciers across the Himalayan range. So the first panel here summarizes, it's a satellite-based study, which summarizes the cumulative length change of the glaciers across the Himalayan sectors. Now, if you see invariably across the Himalaya, we are seeing that glaciers have experienced recession since 1840, but probably except for the Karakoram region, where you see the response is complex. Sometimes the recession is halted, sometimes we have surge type glaciers. So response is regional for the Karakoram region. And these shrinking glaciers, they often get coupled with the glacial lakes as the lakes they form near the snout of the melting glaciers. This figure shows the distribution of bluffs in the Indian Himalayan region. Most of them, they are concentrated in the Karakoram and the Eastern Himalaya. And also most of these bluffs are moraine dammed. And as these moraine dammed lakes breach, they lead to the catastrophic flood in the downstream region. I want to discuss here one example of GLOF that happened on August 2014 in Ladakh, famously known as the Gaya flood. Now, this flood was a little bit different, as the terminal moraine which was blocking the lake did not breach from the surface, but instead there was a subglacial drainage of the meltwater. So this is the field photograph given by Schmitz, and this lake has been actually forming since 1969, and accelerated accelerated rise in its dimension was seen only after 2005. And other study was able to locate the piping mechanism of piping failure, which drained this lake subglacially, and catastrophic flood was generated, destroying village in the downstream. Interestingly, there was no obvious trigger for the failure of the lake. There was no rainfall event that day, no reported earthquake. But this study says that probably it was triggered by a potential rockfall. We don't know if it is related to permafrost or not. It's just a speculative suggestion. There are several hanging glaciers which could have generated an avalanche, leading to overtopping of the glacial lake waters, and hence the breach. Okay, another common hazard in the Himalaya are, of course, the landslide dammed lake. The famous picture, I'm sure many of you must have seen this, is of the Gona lake that was formed by a landslide triggered by an extreme precipitation event in 1893. And this is the landslide scar that you can see, and this is the deposit. It blocked the small glacial stream of Birahi Ganga, which is tributary of Alaknanda. And this lake breached in two pulses. The first breach happened in 1894, again triggered by a rainfall event. And second breach happened in 1970, again triggered by the monsoon event, and led to the catastrophic flooding in the downstream region. So this is how the area looks like. If you go there today, this is the scar. Some of the deposit is still lying there. And this is the drained out lake bed, where we were able to identify a remnant of a boat which was perhaps used at that time. Now, these floods in Himalaya, they are also agents of erosion, especially in the upstream areas, and they are also capable of catastrophically aggrading the riverbed. So just for example, I'm showing here the river terraces created by only two events. This first terrace was created during 1894, and the second terrace was created in 1970. So they do have a lot of implication in terms of sediment mobilization and deposition as well. Okay, perhaps another vulnerability, or another vulnerable zone in the Himalaya are the paraglacial zones, which are, I don't think so they have received as much as attention as they should have. Now, what are paraglacial zones? They are those areas which are not currently occupied by glaciers, but they are influenced directly or indirectly by the glacial and the glacial processes, right? And these are also the regions which were in past occupied by the glaciers as they expanded in the geological history. And as they expanded, they have generated a lot of paraglacial sediments, mostly in form of moraines. Now, as they go back, these sediments get sequestered in these small glaciated valleys, and they get mobilized in event of such as June 2013, amplifying the impact of the flash flood or the disaster. As you can see, this is a paraglacial stream which is pumping out a lot of paraglacial sediment outwards. Example of, or the devastating example, I should rather say, of one such paraglacial valley would be of Hero Ganga. In Sundral et al. 2015, they showed that how this small glacial tributary stream, which seems harmless, pretty stable vegetated slopes, but it is sequestering a lot of moraines and paraglacial sediments like paraglacial fans, talus cones in the upstream area. And these sediments, they got mobilized in the precipitation event and destroyed the Vishnu hydropower project in the downstream. This is the pre-disaster photograph, seemingly stable slope, well-vegetated slope. Nobody could imagine that this entire mountain flank actually got eroded by the event and completely devastated the project. And this is the project when we went there in 2018. Still every monsoon season, because there was a lot of pulse of sediment that was generated, it get mobilized even after a small rainfall. And this is not functioning even at its partial capacity right now. Okay, so coming to the recent weather extremes that happened in the Dhauli Ganga Valley. This is the map which marks the catchment or the watershed of the Dhauli Ganga River. Rishi Ganga is here, and this red box marks the location of the 7th February rockfall. This is the South Tibetan Detachment Zone here. To the north of it, we had the avalanche of 23rd April. Now, you notice there are a lot of large glaciers in this region, and the dotted line I've marked here to show the extent of the paraglacial zone, just to emphasize that this particular valley contains a lot of paraglacial sediments which can get mobilized by these events. Now, I think this event was much talked about. Most of us know that it was initiated in a steep slope of Ronti Ghat, a very small tributary. This is the high resolution imagery that I've taken from Pandey et al. That shows location of the rock fall here. And they suggested, they were able to actually locate the pre-existing fissure, which failed on 7th February event that you can see here. And as this rock mobilized and there was some snow also, it generated a debris flow which moved downstream. The brown color that you're seeing here, it represents the dust plume that rose from the event, suggesting that the sediments that were generated, they were not super saturated here, right? And this is the close-up of the wedge-shaped failure after the disaster. Now, as this debris flow moved from the Ronti Ghat, it blocked the Rishi Ganga River. One of our team members, Dr. Naresh Rana, went there on foot to inspect the area on field, and through visual inspection, he suggested that this blockade was about 20 to 30 meters high. He was also the first one to report this lake, but fortunately, this lake did not drain catastrophically, and all went well. And after on the 7th February, however, after it must have blocked the river, the remaining debris flow further moved downstream, reached the Rainy Village. Here in the pre-disaster photograph, you can see a small hydropower project here. It has, I think, capacity of about 13 megawatt. It got washed away. It was also storing some amount of water in its deserting chamber, which is suggested to be height of about 60 meters. So that would have also added water to this debris flow. Together, it washed the bridge, which is about 20 meter high from the riverbed, and destroyed part of the road as well. And from here, it moved towards the Tapovan hydropower projects in the Dhauli Ganga Valley and completely destroyed the project. Now, we have demarcated the extent of the flood deposit in this valley, and we found that away from these hydropower project, the flood deposition does not exceed more than 4 meters in the downstream areas. But near the Tapovan hydropower project, the sediment bulking was found to be as high as 10 meters. And we've seen this in 2013 also. I'll discuss that a little bit later, suggesting that these hydropower projects temporarily obstructed the debris flow and acted as a force multiplier factor to the particular disaster. And also there are studies which estimate that it took about 16 to 18 minutes to reach this debris flow from its source of origin, suggesting that even if we are to have early warning system in this terrain, the response time has to be very, very quick. It is very short. Okay, so if we talk about the nature of this debris flow flash flood, this first figure shows the elevation profile of the river. Is the source region is marked with the yellow star. There's a glacier here, and you can see that most of the erosion was concentrated in the upstream, which is dictated by the volume of sediment that got mobilized as well as the steep slope. And after a while, after 15 kilometers or so, most of the sediments were deposited. And the transition or the nature of the flash flood was that it changed its nature from debris flow that is having high velocity with dominance of big boulders up to 5 meters, to hyper-concentrated flow as it moved towards the Alaknanda Valley. It only was depositing fine sediments then. So next question is that what really triggered this event? Can we relate this event to climate change? Was the weather unusual? To understand that, we plotted the temperature data. This is satellite-based data taken from NASA Power. So on x-axis we have temperature, on y-axis we have the dates. It's about daily temperature for about a month. And you can see that the temperature was fluctuating, and around 7th February or 6th February, there was a high rise in temperature. However, is this anomalous? I mean, this is some kind of unusual event that happened that day? We don't think so, because if we plot the long-term average, there is rise in temperature in the month of February, which is coincidence with the rise in insolation. And there was additionally some rainfall also for last 3 days in the region. So we don't think that there was something unusual in terms of temperature anomaly or in terms of the extreme precipitation event. However, there was a pre-existing fissure already there, which could have widened under such diurnal temperature fluctuations. And additionally, because the temperature was rising, there was a snowfall, there was fresh snowfall that would have melted and lubricated this mass movement and created the disaster, right? So we think that trigger was, of course, there was a precondition that this fissure was created. We don't know why it was created, but weathered and pulverized rocks would have favored it. This is the terrain which experiences a lot of frost shattering due to the diurnal temperature variation. There could be possibility of microseismicity also that would have generated this fissure. Also, we don't know the extent of permafrost, as I was saying, in the Himalayas. So was this the response of permafrost melting in creation of this pre-existing fissure? These are some of the unanswered questions and all of the possibilities actually, right? And of course, there was a lot of glaciogenic sediments, as it is a paraglacial zone, which amplified the impact of this disaster. Another intriguing question was that how such large amount of volume of water was generated in this debris flow, right? So one possibility could be that there was a supraglacial or proglacial lake in the region, but when we scanned the Google imageries, what was available at that time, we did not find any geomorphic evidence of the same, and that has been now confirmed by the high resolution imagery that has come up recently. So it was not the bursting of supra or proglacial lake. There was snow in this amalgamated mass that moved down the slope. So was it that snow had melted and supplied the required amount of volume of water? Now the model studies, they have shown that even if the snow melts in such hazards, the amount of energy is not so high as to instantaneously melt the snow and convert it immediately to the liquid form of water, right? And now report by EC-Mode has also done some calculations, and they are suggesting that only 15% of the mass comprised of the snow and the energy required to melt that snow immediately was not sufficient. So we ruled out this possibility as well. Third possibility was that there could have been temporary impounding of this debris flow as it moved downstream in fluvially constructed narrow slot gorge sections, right? So these temporary impoundings would have acted as a force multiplier and generated the pulses of the floods in a short duration. Another possibility could be the artificial amplification of the debris flow by the hydropower projects. Especially at Rainey, there was already availability of stored water, which was scavenged by this debris flow. So that definitely supplied water. And the obstruction mechanism that I was talking about earlier, both by Rainey hydropower project and the Tapovan hydropower project would have amplified its effect. And additionally, we also think that there was presence of subglacial water in the catchment, which got scavenged by this debris flow. So these three possibilities we think supplied the additional volume of water. What do I mean by this? I'll just explain in the next slide. This is the Google imagery of 2017, and if you just zoom it to below the just below downstream of this rock fall, you would see that there are several cavities in the sediment, and the walls of these cavities have collapsed. Now, these structures, they are known to be associated with dead ice. This is not much far off from the snout of the active glaciers. So these structures, they are associated with dead ice, which over the time melt, and there is existence of subglacial aquifers as well. As debris flow would have moved over this region, it would have scavenged all of the dead ice and any subglacial aquifer that was present. Okay, so if we look at the Dhauli Ganga Valley and its geological archives, we see that these events have been happening over geological past in the region. So this is the catchment again of Dhauli Ganga, and gray color here marks the large glaciers which would have generated a lot of sediment. And this yellow segment we investigated in year 2018 and found that there are multiple deposits like this at multiple locations, suggesting that debris flows like this have been generated in the past. I think if we look at these deposits and analyze these deposits in detail, we will be able to generate some kind of pattern of frequency and maybe try to have a better understanding of the triggering factors. This particular first photograph is from Surai Thota here, and this particular photograph is just at the confluence of Dunagiri. At the base, we have the glacial sediments corresponding to a moraine, probably 70 years, 1,000 years or so. And the above sequence here corresponds to the debris flow events. We were able to identify at least 3 events overtopping the glacial sediments. Okay, so coming to the 23rd April snow avalanche that happened upstream of the Rishi Ganga. This is the 7th February event location, and if you move up, this is the Girti Ganga where the avalanche happened, right? And again, you see there are numerous large glaciers here. This is the STDZ, and the red lines that you see are the relict and active cirques. What are cirques? Cirques are the bowl-shaped, armchair-shaped depressions which have been carved out by the past glaciation. They may have some small glaciers in them at present, or may not have. They may have been vacated, right? And this is the photograph aerial photograph that was given by BRO of the avalanche. Now, whatever photograph and a small video clip that I saw of the event, we suggest that this disaster originated probably in the crown of a cirque wall here. So here is the red circle marks the location of the avalanche deposit, and it is just below this relict cirque, which has a well-defined track in it, right? And if you look at this slope, which is of course barren, it's a south-facing slope of Girti Valley. There's a complex, large cirque present here with multiple small valleys with well-defined tracks, again probably suggesting that these events have been part of the system, part of the terrain since geological past. Now, again, if we talk about the trigger, avalanches, they are known to be triggered by unstable snowpack conditions. More than often, they are influenced by the local meteorology. This event, however, was a little bit unique in the sense that it happened in the month of April. Usually, avalanches, they are known to happen in the winter months when there is a lot of loading by the fresh snow and it leads to unstable snowpack condition, and then the avalanche happens. And but this one happened under the warmer temperature conditions. I'll come back to that a little bit later. We also cannot rule out the trigger to be as microseismicity or anthropogenic disturbances, which various studies show have been known to destabilize the snowpack, right? But since we did not have any evidence for that, we tried to analyze how were the local weather conditions at that time in the valley. So again, this is the satellite data from NASA Power. The blue line here shows the precipitation, and the orange line here shows the insolation from 1st April to 25th April. Of course, it's spring season, so you would expect the temperatures, they were rising, but there have been happening events of heavy snowfall in the region, especially just before the avalanche. Now, this heavy snowfall, firstly, it could destabilize the existing snow pack condition if it was there. Additionally, because the temperatures, they were warming, it would generate a lot of wet snow, which further helped to mobilize the avalanche. So this could be one of the possibilities. I mean, certainly it's not for sure, but this is one of the possibilities that we're suggesting that could have triggered the avalanche. And this relationship between avalanche and temperature is also demonstrated by the long-term record. It's a study by Ballesteros that was undertaken in the Western Himalaya, and it is based on tree rings. In the first figure that you see here is on the x-axis, we have the probability of snow avalanches, and these are the calendar years since 1900. The points here are the points of 144 trees that they utilized for their study, and this is the modeled avalanche probability curve. And they found that there was one-on-one relationship between warming temperatures and the avalanches in the region. They have done some principal component analysis and found that the warming temperature influenced the avalanche. I see there's a ping, I think. I heard a ping. Is there any question? No, sorry. So again, if we look at the terrain, we are finding geological evidence of perhaps debris flows which were influenced by these avalanches. This is Google imagery of Malari village just downstream of the 23rd April event. Again, you see there's a large complex cirque with several relict and modern day cirque. They're hanging glaciers also. In fact, this village of Malari is itself located on a huge debris flow deposits. We identified at least 4 events here. And I think this could be a very good geological archive if we want to understand the patterns of such catastrophic events in the past. And the last photograph that you're seeing here is from near the Niti village. Again, there are several cirques here with serrated head walls. There's a clear-cut track here, and we could identify a deposit, debris flow deposit here also. Again, suggesting that this terrain is vulnerable to these events. These events have been happening since a long time here. Now, another potential geological archive which can probably help us to build a longer history of these extreme events could be the paleoflood archives or the slack water deposits. These photographs are from Alaknanda Valley. These are the long shots, and this is the close-up of a slack water deposits, which are the upward finding sequences comprising of sand and silt couplets. So each one couplet of sand and silt would correspond to a flood event. And Wasson et al. In 2013 reconstructed 1,000-year-old history of these events, and they suggested in the last 200 years or so there has been rise in the frequency of these events. These events could be coupled to such debris flows because, as I said, in Higher Himalaya particularly, the landslides and the debris flows, they are intimately coupled with the fluvial system. So this could be an additional archives that can help us to generate the long-term history. Now, we all know that there has been major intervention by us in these inherently fragile valleys. So it is only obvious to study what kind of impact we are making on these disasters. So the first figure that I'm showing you is again field photograph of the Alaknanda Valley just below the Srinagar town. You can see the deposits of June 2013 have overtopped the surface of 1970 flood, suggesting the magnitude of flood was higher at this location, and this is the corresponding profile, elevation profile of the section where you have the high flood level of 1970 overtopped by the high flood level of June 2013. Interestingly, the June 2013 flood deposits have not overtopped the 1970 surfaces if you go upstream from the barrage. This particular location is just downstream of the Srinagar hydropower project. If you move upstream from the barrage, we do not find such kind of amplification by June 2013. Does that imply that it was amplified by the hydropower project? The study was done in 2015 by Sundral et al., and that is what is shown in this figure. This is the digital elevation model near the Srinagar town. The small blue bar is the barrage of the hydropower. You have the North Almora thrust here. To the south of it, phyllites rocks dominate, and to the north of it, we have the dominance of quartzite lithology. Now, using chemical index of alteration, where phyllites, they have the values ranging between 70 to 80, and quartzite, they usually fall between 45 to 50. They, using these two as end members, they try to analyze the flood deposits after the 2013 event, and tried to quantify how much sediment was mobilized locally and how much sediment came from the long distance transport. Now, I'm saying that sediment was mobilized locally because this barrage is constructed in the phylite rocks, and whatever muck they had dumped along the river valley was generated from the phylite lithology. And they found that the flood deposits which actually inundated the Srinagar town had dominance of this the hydropower muck, where of course the contribution decreases as we move away from the barrage. And using this as an evidence, the National Green Tribunal also fined the hydropower project for, I think, of 9 crores or so. So indeed, these hydropower projects have been known to amplify the impact of these disasters. And what do I talk about the warning systems, especially in context of the hydropower project? These are the boards that we get not only in Uttarakhand but in Himachal also. Wherever we have the hydropower projects, they just leave it to the public. Any day, anytime, you can the level of the river can rise as they leave the water. So your life of your livestock is your own responsibility. We need to move ahead from that. So if I summarize what we understand from these events, certainly we cannot one-on-one relate it to the climate change per se, but if we look at the climate trends and the projections of both the temperature and as well as the extreme events, we could be seeing, these events could be seen as a warning signal of the terrain as a response to the regional climate warming. And not only these two events, post these events, on 27th April, an avalanche occurred in Karakoram region. Between 4th to 20th May, the southern mountain front in states of Uttarakhand and Himachal, they have seen activation of small streams or the debris flows. There have been multiple events of cloudbursts. So there does seem to be a regional connection for these events. And higher Himalayan ranges, and particularly the small channels in the higher Himalayan ranges, look like the hotspots. They have been the ones which got activated during all these recent events as well. And of course, as we have seen in 2013, as we have seen in Tapovan and Ranjani also, we have only amplified the impact of these disasters. So if I talk about what should be the way ahead for these studies, of course, one way would be to generate more scientific data. We really don't understand more particularly about their triggering mechanism, their frequencies, or their recurrence intervals. So long-term archives, geological archives could really help us to understand these events better. And also, when we do spot some kind of anomaly, there's a need for regular monitoring rather than just hanging a poster there. Also, I think one way to install or to promote judicious use of the resources in terms of the early warning systems would be to incorporate the geomorphological and geological understanding of the terrain. We already know that paraglacial zones are sensitive to these events, or we could already understand which tributaries are more vulnerable or have a history of generating these events. These locations should altogether be avoided, which was actually suggested in 2014 by Chopra Committee. Also, Tapovan project, Rainy project, they were already red flagged, but of course that did not materialize on ground. So that is also, I think, feel that would be an important point to make a difference there. And right now, we don't really have any kind of disaster management plan. Of course, it is complex. It starts from creating an information system where early warning systems are part of it. It involves academicians, inputs from scientists, it involves the state machinery, and then how you would implement it on the ground with help of the community. But we do need a robust disaster management plans for the terrain. Yeah. So with that, I would like to end my talk. Thank you.